All their lives are impacted by this. Every miner I have here is relying on this to work. So I've put a lot of people at risk, and myself and my family included. This has to work. And we're just going to fight every step along the way.
Some miners chase gold their whole lives and never find it. Others lose everything in a single moment of bad judgment. But Fred Lewis, he managed to do both in the same week. What started as the worst disaster in Klondike history was about to become the most incredible comeback story ever told. When a man loses $20 million of investor money in a mining catastrophe, he doesn't get a second chance. He gets a death sentence. But Fred Lewis wasn't ready to die, and the mountain still had secrets to tell. Hit that like button and subscribe right now, because what you're about to witness is 3 days of pure chaos that will either destroy a man completely or crown him the luckiest miner in gold rush history. Fred Lewis had spent 5 years building his dream. What started as a modest claim in the remote Klondike wilderness had grown into one of the most sophisticated mining operations north of Dawson City. Every dollar he'd earned, every favor he'd called in, every sleepless night had gone into creating something that could compete with the big corporate miners who dominated the region. The Grizzly Creek claim sprawled across 2,400 acres of promising ground, dotted with test holes that had shown consistent gold concentrations averaging half an ounce per ton. Not spectacular, but steady. The kind of reliable grades that could support a family operation for decades. Fred had mortgaged his house, sold his truck, and borrowed against his life insurance to fund the initial equipment purchases. When that wasn't enough, he'd turned to investors. Harold Brennan was the first to believe in Fred's vision. A former oil executive from Calgary with deep pockets and deeper skepticism, Harold had visited the claim on a frigid March morning when most sensible people stayed indoors. But Fred's passion was infectious, his geological knowledge impressive, and his 5-year plan meticulously detailed. Harold wrote the first check for $2 million. Within 6 months, a consortium of 12 investors had committed $20 million to turning Fred's dream into reality. The wash plant that rose from the permafrost was a marvel of modern mining engineering, capable of processing 500 cubic yards of pay dirt per hour. It featured state-of-the-art gravity separation systems, computer-controlled water management, and recovery circuits designed to capture gold particles smaller than grains of sand. The main structure stood 30 feet tall, its steel framework gleaming against the wilderness backdrop like a cathedral dedicated to the pursuit of wealth. Supporting the wash plant was an ecosystem of equipment that represented decades of mining evolution. 2 Caterpillar 374 excavators, each worth over $1 million, worked in perfect synchronization to feed the plant's hungry conveyors. A fleet of articulated haul trucks, their 40-ton beds lined with hardened steel, created a continuous parade of pay dirt from pit to processing. Generators the size of shipping containers provided reliable power in a region where the electrical grid was more theoretical than practical. The operation ran like clockwork through the summer mining season. Fred's crew of 18 men worked rotating 12-hour shifts, processing an average of 4,000 cubic yards per day during peak season. The gold recovery was steady, if not spectacular, typically yielding between 15 and 20 ounces per day, enough to cover operating costs and provide modest profits that kept investors satisfied. Fred had become more than just a miner. He was a businessman, an employer, a pillar of the small community that had grown around his operation. His payroll supported 18 families. Local suppliers in Dawson City competed for his equipment contracts. The success of Grizzly Creek had attracted other miners to the region, creating a mini gold rush that brought prosperity to an area that had seen little economic activity since the original Klondike Stampede. But success in mining is always temporary, always dependent on the next ton of dirt, the next test hole, the next season's results. By the 5th year of operation, Fred's easily accessible ground was showing signs of depletion. Surface gravels that had yielded steady gold were giving way to harder rock that required more aggressive extraction methods. The decision to expand into the hillside behind his wash plant wasn't driven by greed, it was driven by necessity. Geological surveys conducted by a firm out of Vancouver had identified a promising bench of ancient river gravels buried beneath 40 feet of overburden. Core samples from the target area showed encouraging gold concentrations, enough to justify the expensive process of stripping away the covering material to expose the pay dirt beneath. The blasting operation was planned for months, with environmental permits, engineering studies, and safety protocols all carefully documented. Fred hired Jake Morrison specifically for this expansion project. The weathered Texan had spent 30 years setting charges in mines from Nevada to Alaska, with a reputation for precision that made him worth his substantial daily rate. Jake studied the geology for weeks, calculating powder factors and blast patterns with the meticulous care of a surgeon planning a delicate operation. The morning everything changed started like any other in Fred Lewis's 30-year mining career. Coffee steamed in frozen air at 5 a.m. as his crew gathered around Jake Morrison for the daily safety briefing. The blast pattern called for 16 strategically placed charges to strip away the overburden in controlled sections, exposing the gold-bearing gravels beneath, without damaging the wash plant that sat 200 yards away. Fred positioned himself at the observation point he'd used dozens of times before. Binoculars trained on the blast zone as his crew made final preparations. The wash plant hummed behind him, processing the last loads of surface material while they prepared to access the deeper, richer ground that would secure the operation's future. Everything Fred had built over 5 years, the equipment, the reputation, the livelihoods of 18 families, depended on this expansion, working exactly as planned. But Jake Morrison had been drinking the night before, not falling down drunk, not stumbling or slurring his words, but enough to dull the precision that had made him legendary in mining circles. The calculations that should have been double-checked were trusted to memory. The depth measurements that should have been verified were accepted at face value. When Jake placed his charges that morning, he miscalculated the geology by 18 critical inches, driving the explosives deeper into a layer of unstable shale that geological surveys had specifically warned against disturbing. When Fred's radio crackled with the 10-second warning, he felt the familiar anticipation that came with controlled explosions. The first charge detonated precisely on schedule, throwing up a controlled plume of rock and dirt. The second followed 2 seconds later. Then the third, each blast carefully timed to maximize efficiency while minimizing shock waves that could damage nearby equipment. The fourth charge changed everything. Planted too deep in the unstable shale layer, it triggered a chain reaction that no amount of engineering experience could have predicted. The mountain didn't just break, it liquefied. What started as controlled demolition became geological catastrophe as 10,000 tons of rock, soil, and ice began sliding downhill in a slow-motion avalanche that consumed everything in its path. Fred watched through his binoculars as his life's work disappeared beneath the slide. The wash plant, worth over $8 million, vanished first, its steel framework crumpling like paper as thousands of tons of debris buried it completely. The generator farm that powered the operation disappeared next, then the maintenance shop where millions of dollars in spare parts and specialized tools had been stored. Excavators and haul trucks, positioned to resume work after the blast, were swept away like toys in a flood. The sound was indescribable, a deep, rumbling roar that seemed to come from the Earth's core, punctuated by the metallic screams of twisting steel and the sharp cracks of shattering rock. The avalanche lasted less than 3 minutes, but those minutes contained the destruction of everything Fred Lewis had spent 5 years building. When the dust finally settled, Fred found himself staring at a moonscape where his operation used to be. The silence that followed was more devastating than the roar of destruction. No hum of generators, no rumble of conveyor belts, no mechanical symphony of a working mine. Just the whisper of settling debris and the distant crack of cooling rock. Tommy Kowalski, Fred's foreman, appeared at his elbow with a handheld radio crackling with panicked voices. Crew members who'd been working near the buried equipment were accounted for, a miracle that no lives had been lost in the catastrophe. But the equipment, the infrastructure, the 5 years of careful construction, all of it was gone, buried beneath a mountain of rubble that would take years and millions of dollars to clear. The investors' calls started within hours. Word traveled fast in the tight-knit mining community, and by noon, Fred's satellite phone was ringing constantly with voices demanding explanations he couldn't provide. Harold Brennan's call came as Fred stood in the ruins of his wash plant, staring at twisted steel that had once been the pride of his operation. "Lewis," Harold's voice was sharp with barely controlled fury. "I'm looking at news footage of what used to be our $20 million investment. Tell me this is some kind of joke." Fred tried to explain about geological anomalies and unpredictable rock formations, but Harold cut him off with words that hit like physical blows. "You just buried our children's college funds under a pile of rocks. You better pray there's something valuable under all that debris, because if there isn't, you're going to spend the rest of your life in court." The other investors were equally brutal. 5 years of careful relationship building evaporated in a series of phone calls that grew increasingly hostile as the magnitude of the disaster became clear. These weren't just business partners. They were friends, neighbors, people who'd trusted Fred with their retirement savings and children's futures. The weight of that responsibility crushed down on him as he surveyed the destruction that had wiped out everything he'd promised to protect. Fred's crew gathered their belongings with the hollow-eyed stare of men whose livelihoods had vanished in minutes. 18 families suddenly faced unemployment in a region where mining jobs were scarce and other industries virtually non-existent. Some crew members had worked for Fred since the operation's early days, building not just professional relationships but genuine friendships based on shared hardship and mutual respect. Tommy Kowalski was the last to approach Fred with his resignation. The foreman had been with the operation from the beginning, had helped Fred install the first pieces of equipment when the claim was nothing but wilderness and dreams. "Fred," Tommy's voice was thick with emotion, "I've got 2 kids in college and a mortgage in Dawson City. I can't wait around hoping for miracles." Fred shook Tommy's hand and watched him walk away, understanding that he was losing more than an employee. He was losing a piece of his own history. But 30 years of mining had taught Fred Lewis to read geological signs that others missed. And as his crew prepared for the exodus home, something in the newly exposed cliff face caught his attention with the force of revelation. The blast hadn't just destroyed his equipment, it had peeled back geological layers like pages in an ancient book, revealing rock formations that hadn't seen daylight since the last ice age. The exposed face showed classic gold-bearing geology, quartz veins threading through ancient metamorphic rock like frozen lightning. Not the cloudy, worthless quartz that fools amateur prospectors, but the clear, crystalline variety that serious miners know can host serious wealth. Fred pulled his handheld analyzer from his jacket, a $15,000 device that had paid for itself many times over in 5 years of operation. The first reading made him blink and check his equipment. Gold concentrations of 23 ounces per ton, higher than anything he'd ever seen on his claim. The second sample tested even richer, 31 ounces per ton. The third sample, taken from a quartz vein as thick as his arm, showed readings that belonged in fantasy novels rather than geological reports. 47 ounces per ton of pure gold. Fred's hands shook as he took sample after sample, each one confirming what seemed impossible. The disaster that had destroyed his operation had also revealed a gold deposit of extraordinary richness, a vein that could contain more wealth than his entire 5-year operation had produced. The irony was almost cruel. The explosion that had bankrupted him had also exposed the discovery that could make him legendary. Racing back to the communications trailer, one of the few structures that had survived the avalanche, Fred burst through the door where his radio operator was fielding angry calls from equipment suppliers demanding immediate payment for buried machinery. "Cut every line," Fred commanded, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and excitement that bordered on madness. "Get me an emergency satellite link to Vancouver. I need Harold Brennan and every investor on a conference call in 2 hours." The radio operator stared at Fred like he'd suffered a complete breakdown. "Fred, they want your head on a spike. Harold Brennan is talking about criminal charges and civil lawsuits. What could you possibly say that would—" But Fred was already spreading geological maps across the conference table, his movements urgent and precise as he prepared to make the most important presentation of his life. The video conference that followed would become legend in mining circles. The moment a man, facing complete destruction, staked everything on a discovery that defied geological probability. Fred faced a screen filled with 12 furious investors, their faces twisted with the kind of rage that destroys careers and ruins lives. Harold Brennan spoke for the group, his voice carrying the cold finality of judgment. "Lewis, you have exactly 5 minutes to explain why we shouldn't have you arrested for gross negligence and criminal mismanagement." Fred had never been eloquent. He was a man of action rather than words, more comfortable reading rock formations than reading people. But standing before that screen, facing the complete destruction of his reputation and the financial ruin of people who'd trusted him, Fred found a clarity he'd never possessed before. He spoke with the passion of a scientist, presenting groundbreaking research and the urgency of a man whose life depended on being believed. The sample results spoke louder than any words. Gold concentrations that made the richest Alaska claims look like sandbox operations, quartz veins that extended deep into the mountain's heart, potentially containing hundreds of millions in recoverable ore. Geological formations that had been hidden for millennia, waiting for exactly the kind of violent exposure that had destroyed his equipment to reveal their secrets. Harold Brennan was the first to break the stunned silence that followed Fred's presentation. "Lewis, if this is some desperate con game, If you're trying to cover up your incompetence with fairy tales about magical gold veins, we'll destroy you so thoroughly that no one in the mining industry will ever speak your name again. Fred met the camera with eyes that burned with the fever of absolute conviction. Harold, I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust 30 years of experience and geological evidence that can't lie. Independent geological consultants were brought into the conference call, experts from Denver, Johannesburg, and Perth, who examined Fred's evidence with the skepticism of scientists and the wariness of people who'd seen too many mining scams. One by one, their objections crumbled beneath data that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as wishful thinking. The samples were authentic. The geology was consistent with major gold deposits. The potential was beyond anything they'd encountered in decades of professional experience. The transformation of the investors' attitude was gradual but unmistakable. Fury gave way to cautious interest, then to the calculating excitement of people who'd built fortunes by recognizing opportunity disguised as disaster. Emergency funding discussions began before the conference call ended. Not just money to replace what had been lost, but capital to exploit a discovery that could dwarf anything the Klondike had produced since the original gold rush. By midnight, $50 million in emergency funding had been approved. Fred was given 72 hours to prove that his disaster was actually the luckiest accident in mining history. The timeline wasn't arbitrary. Legal and regulatory challenges were already mobilizing. Rival claims were being researched, and environmental groups were preparing lawsuits that could freeze the operation for years. If Fred was going to extract the gold, it had to happen before the lawyers and bureaucrats could stop him. The next morning brought the thunder of rotor blades as the first wave of helicopters arrived, carrying the components of a mining operation unlike anything the Yukon had ever seen. These weren't the standard machines that had been buried in the avalanche. They were specialized pieces of equipment designed for high-grade ore extraction, flown in from mining operations across 3 continents. The crew that assembled was equally extraordinary. Hard rock miners from Nevada gold operations, where they'd earned 6-figure salaries extracting ore from underground veins. Permafrost specialists from Siberian diamond mines, where they'd learned to work in conditions that killed unprepared workers. Process engineers from South African platinum operations, where efficiency meant the difference between massive profits and catastrophic losses. The mobile wash plant that took shape over the next 18 hours was a technological marvel. Modular components that locked together with Swiss precision, creating a processing facility capable of handling ore concentrations that would overwhelm conventional equipment. Every system was oversized, overbuilt, and over-engineered to handle the extraordinary richness of the ore they expected to encounter. Fred supervised every aspect of the construction with the intensity of a man whose entire future depended on perfect execution. This wasn't just about recovering from disaster. It was about vindication, about proving that 5 years of careful work and 30 years of accumulated knowledge hadn't been wasted on a catastrophic mistake. Every bolt tightened, every connection tested, every system calibrated represented another step toward either complete redemption or final destruction. The first test samples from the exposed vein were rushed to the mobile laboratory, a trailer packed with spectrometric equipment worth more than most small mines' entire operations. Fred paced outside like an expectant father, while technicians processed ore samples that would determine whether his desperate gamble had any foundation in reality. When the lab door opened, the senior geologist's face was pale with something approaching religious awe. "Mr. Lewis," his voice barely rose above a whisper, "I've analyzed ore samples from 6 continents and 40 different operations. I've never encountered concentrations like these. Some of these samples are testing at over 100 ounces per ton. This isn't mining. This is harvesting pure gold." The verification brought its own problems. Word of the strike began leaking, despite security precautions that included armed guards and communications blackouts. Rival mining crews appeared on distant ridges like wolves scenting blood, their telescopes trained on Fred's operation with predatory interest. Government helicopters began circling with increasing frequency, officials demanding environmental assessments and regulatory compliance that could shut down operations for months. Local claim holders who'd ignored this barren mountainside for decades suddenly discovered survey maps suggesting their property boundaries extended further than historical records indicated. Environmental groups raised concerns about watershed contamination and wildlife disruption, threatening federal intervention that could freeze operations permanently. Lawyers descended from every direction, filing injunctions and property disputes designed to tie up the operation in court battles that could last for years. Fred found himself commanding a war effort rather than a mining operation. Every hour of delay gave his enemies additional time to mobilize legal weapons designed to steal his discovery through bureaucratic rather than physical means. The window of opportunity was closing with each passing moment, measured not in days but in hours before the inevitable shutdown orders arrived. The main excavation began at dawn on the second day, with the largest piece of equipment Fred had ever operated, a Caterpillar 6020B, capable of moving 60 cubic yards of material with each swing of its massive bucket. The first cut into the exposed vein brought up or so rich it seemed to glow in the morning sunlight. Chunks of quartz threaded with gold veins visible to the naked eye. The processing plant screamed to life, its conveyors and screens overwhelmed by material richer than any equipment designer had anticipated. Gold began accumulating in the recovery circuits faster than the systems could handle, requiring constant adjustment and modification to prevent valuable material from escaping capture. The sound was industrial symphony, crushers pulverizing ore, water pumps maintaining hydraulic pressure, generators roaring to provide power for equipment that pushed every system beyond its design specifications. Men worked in shifts that defied human endurance, driven by the knowledge that every hour might be their last before shutdown orders arrived. Equipment failures multiplied under the relentless pace. Hydraulic hoses burst, conveyor belts snapped, electrical systems overloaded by demands they weren't designed to handle. Repairs were made with cutting torches and sledgehammers, speed taking priority over precision in the desperate race against bureaucratic intervention. The gold room became a fortress, protected by armed guards who carried weapons worth less than the treasure they defended. Each pour from the retort furnace brought gasps from hardened miners who thought they'd seen everything the earth could offer. Bars that should have weighed ounces emerged weighing pounds, their surfaces mirror-bright with the captured wealth of geological processes spanning millions of years. Processing continued through the night under banks of floodlights that turned the mountainside into a theater for industrial drama. The convoy of haul trucks created a continuous loop between the excavation and the processing plant, their 40-ton beds overflowing with ore that sparkled like captured starlight under artificial illumination. Radio chatter crackled with constant updates, production numbers that climbed higher with each passing hour, recovery rates that defied everything the operators had learned in decades of mining experience. The final push began at dawn of the third day, as Fred prepared for one last assault on the remaining accessible portions of the gold vein. Government helicopters dotted the horizon like approaching storm clouds, carrying shutdown orders that would end operations permanently. Environmental officials prepared injunctions that would freeze the site until lengthy impact studies could be completed. Rival claimants marshaled legal teams to dispute ownership of ground that had been worthless just days before. Fred assembled his exhausted crew in the pre-dawn darkness, their faces hollow with fatigue but burning with the fever of men who'd glimpsed impossible wealth. They had perhaps 8 hours before the authorities arrived with papers that would end everything. 8 hours to extract every ounce of gold from a discovery that might never be accessible again. What followed was the most intensive mining operation in Klondike history. 18 hours of superhuman effort that pushed both men and machines beyond all reasonable limits. Excavators bit into the mountain with desperate fury, their buckets overflowing with ore, so rich it seemed to mock the laws of geology and economics. The processing plant operated at 150% of design capacity, every component stressed to the breaking point in pursuit of treasure that transcended monetary value. Gold poured from the retorts in an endless stream that seemed to flow from the mountain's heart directly into history books. Bar after bar filled with metal so pure it appeared to generate its own light, stacking up in the secure room until armed guards could barely navigate between towers of wealth that exceeded most nations' gold reserves. As the sun reached its zenith and the sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, Fred supervised the final extraction with the calm satisfaction of a man who'd achieved the impossible. The government officials who landed with their shutdown orders found an operation already winding down, its primary objective completed in the time it takes most people to recover from a weekend. The final tally, when it came, silenced every skeptic and vindicated every desperate decision Fred had made. $35 million in recovered gold, extracted in 72 hours from ground that had been considered worthless just a week before. The disaster that had destroyed his 5-year operation had revealed a treasure that dwarfed anything he'd ever imagined possible. Harold Brennan stood in Fred's gold room with tears streaming down his face, his earlier threats of lawsuits and criminal charges forgotten in the face of wealth that exceeded his most optimistic projections. The other investors arrived by chartered helicopter, their anger transformed into awe as they witnessed stacks of gold bars that represented not just recovered losses, but generational wealth. The crew members who'd abandoned Fred after the avalanche returned with desperate pleas for employment, understanding that they'd walked away from the greatest mining story of their lifetimes. Environmental officials who'd arrived to shut down the operation found themselves studying extraction techniques that would be taught in engineering schools for generations. As winter settled over the Klondike and the immediate chaos of the discovery subsided, Fred Lewis found himself transformed from struggling miner to industry legend. The man who'd lost $20 million in a catastrophic explosion had recovered $35 million in the most intense mining operation ever attempted, proving that sometimes the greatest disasters are merely preparation for the greatest triumphs. The mountain that had tried to bury Fred Lewis under 10,000 tons of rock and regret had instead revealed treasures that ensured his place in mining history. Standing on his transformed claim as the Aurora Borealis painted the winter sky in sheets of green fire, Fred understood something that every successful miner eventually learns: that gold doesn't care about your plans, your fears, or your limitations. It only cares about your willingness to risk everything when opportunity presents itself disguised as catastrophe.